Okay, today I want to talk about our family emergency fund, what it is and how it works. Okay, so first thing first, let's define what an emergency fund is, right? So I just went Google, did a quick Google search. An emergency fund is a cash reserve that is specifically set aside for unplanned expenses or financial emergencies. That's not news to anybody. That's something that we've heard of. An emergency fund is something that exists. I didn't create that idea. It's something that people already are aware of. Basically, it's rainy day money, right? Okay, so the difference, what I'm going to be talking about today is how our family operates with a pooled, a family emergency fund, as opposed to the individual emergency fund that most people who bother to have an emergency fund, the way that they operate. So that's what an emergency fund is normally. So let's also talk about like a rule of thumb, like how much should be in an emergency fund, right? And if we look here, they say between 3 and 6 months of living expenses. Between 3 and 6 months of living expenses, right? So, long story short, what that means is like the rule of thumb is between 3 and 6 months. We're gonna say 6 months, just to keep it simple. If you, let's say for instance, lose your job, do you have enough money to cover your living expenses for 6 months? That's basically the logic behind the 6 months amount. The 6 months amount to cover your emergency fund. So, long story short, if you have somebody who, for instance, has a budget similar to the one that's here, right? They have an income of $3,000, they have expenses of $2,000, and then every month they have $1,000 left over. Basically, if you're going to have 6 months of your living expenses saved up, then what that equals is $12,000. What that means is for 6 months, I can pay my bills that are equal to $2,000 per month. Okay. Okay, cool. So $2,000 per month of expenses times 6 months is where we get this $12,000 per month. For not $12,000 per month, you get this total of $12,000 for a properly capitalized emergency fund for an individual. Okay. Now, with that said, like I say, the main thing I want to talk about is how our family emergency fund operates, right? So we don't have individual emergency funds. We have a family emergency fund in which individual family members contribute to, and we create that pool for when there is for when ever any member of the family has an emergency, they can tap into that pool, right? So in order to explain how that operates and how it works, I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about how individuals would operate with their own individual emergency fund, and then I'm going to come down here and talk about how our family emergency fund works and compare and contrast those two things. Okay. Okay, so first and foremost, in this area right here, I have emergency fund as individuals, and what I put here, this is the normal unorganized way in which people are not working together as a group. So these are 4 individuals who are operating as individuals, right? And I'll show you why I put 4 people here, just to do a comparison to a family that has 4 people operating as a unit. Okay. So long story short, I already described where the $12,000 number comes from, right? 6 months of $2,000 per month of expenses, and this is how a person will come up with $12,000 number for the emergency fund that they will save up. Okay, now we know that a lot of people don't even get anywhere close to doing that. If you are to believe what this article says, it says nearly 4 in 10, that's 40%, of Americans lack enough money to cover a $400 emergency expense. So if that is true, if this article is true, and if that's actually the case in real life, then we know most people are definitely not. They don't even have an emergency fund individually that is adequate. So this 12,000 really won't even be something that the average person would even have. Well, a lot of people wouldn't have, but if they were to be properly capitalized with an emergency fund, this is what it would look like. Okay. So let's compare it to the family situation in order to make this make sense. Long story short, if you got an individual, let's see. So first and foremost, how our family emergency fund works is this: we require each one of our adult family members to contribute $5,000 each to the family emergency fund, right? So now you can kind of see, and then I will talk about the benefits of doing it our way over being an individual way, and that's how we're going to work through this video. So the first thing first, all of our adult family members contribute $5,000 to the family emergency fund, and actually if you have children, then that's an additional $2,500 that you would contribute per child. But let's just keep the example simple and say these are individuals without children. Okay, so each individual is required to deposit $5,000 to the family emergency fund, right? So if you're dealing in a situation where there are 4 family members who are operating together and each one of these family members contribute $5,000 each, then what the family emergency fund will contain is this $20,000 total, okay? Now, what are the benefits of doing it this way as opposed to this way? One thing I don't want you to get confused about is these are 4 individuals. These people are not working together as a family. These are just 4 individuals. I'll put 4 individuals here in order to illustrate a point that I will make very soon, but do not confuse this. These are 4 individual people working as individual people. These are 4 individual people. Down here are 4 individual people working together as a collective family. Okay? So the first benefit of working as a family as opposed to working as an individual is the smaller amount of savings that is required per individual for us, right? So like we said up here, in order for an individual to be properly capitalized in their emergency fund, then they would need 6 months of their monthly expenses. That 6 months times this 2,000 is this 12,000. Well, you already see that by operating a family fund and you're just being one person of many who is contributing to that fund, then we don't have to have people contribute as much as this individual would need in order to have their fund adequately funded. Our family fund is adequately funded by having members contribute a significant amount less than what an individual would need. So what I mean is our individual family members only have to contribute $5,000 as opposed to, in this scenario, an individual who would have to contribute $12,000. Okay, so benefit number 1 is a smaller amount of savings required per individual. You only have to put $5,000 in. Okay. The next benefit is a bigger pool of funds available when an emergency occurs. So this allows me to explain another part of the way our family emergency fund operates. Long story short, we have a pooled fund, and if you are one of these individuals who have contributed your money, then you are now a part of an emergency fund that has $20,000 in it. If you have an emergency, theoretically, this entire amount is at your disposal. Now, for practical reasons that I will explain later on, this is not necessarily something that we worry about. We don't worry about people having to make such huge pools because of insurance, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the point is, the second benefit is, even though I only contributed $5,000 to the family pool, if I literally need $7,000 or I need $9,000 or $10,000, it is there for me to pull because this is how the family pool operates. As long as I make my contribution to the emergency fund, if I run into an emergency, I can make a pull out of the emergency fund. Okay, so the second benefit is a bigger pool of funds available when an emergency occurs for each individual. I only put in $5,000, but I really have access to $20,000. Okay. Okay, now the third final benefit of the family emergency fund over the individual emergency fund is the fact that more funds are available for investing, and more members equal a greater effect. So let's talk a little bit about that. First thing we have to understand in order to understand the value of this is that this emergency fund is just one part of a system that contains many moving parts, right? So we have to understand that within the context of our family, this emergency fund is just one piece of it. And specifically in our family, every dime that's left over after you pay your bills goes to investing. And we do that because investing is something that is important to us. I say that because I want to make the point that when we find other ways to optimize our investment process, it is a good thing for us. And having this family emergency fund gets at is another way to improve our investment process in an additional marginal way. And that's what I'm talking about here in number 3, and I'll explain what I mean. Which gets at why I had 4 individuals up here. Now, if you compare 4 individuals operating as individuals up here and to 4 family members here, what happens is you have to also understand that when you have an emergency fund, this money has to be sitting in some account that's probably not earning very much money, because in case of an emergency, you need to be able to access this money quickly. And the type of accounts that allow you to access the money quickly are probably more than likely accounts that are not earning very much money, like a checking account or savings account. I don't have to tell you that. You're probably aware that checking accounts don't pay you very much money. Checking accounts don't pay you anything most of the time. Savings account don't pay you very much money for having your money in those accounts. So these are not optimal places where you want to have a lot of cash at. That's one thing that you need to understand as I make this next point, as more funds available for investing. Here, if you have 4 people operating as individuals, and there's a total of, like, let's say for instance, maybe these people are in the same family, but they don't operate as a unit. They don't move as a unit, and they all got individual emergency funds. Essentially, each one of them will have their own 12,000, and each one of them will have their own, let's say, a savings account that's not earning anything, and they will have to sit this 12,000 in that savings account, and each one of them will do that. And if you total up what the total is when all of them do sit their money in that savings account, then what will be sitting in that savings account will be a total of $48,000. But it will be spread out over 4 individual accounts, because these individuals are operating as individuals and not as a group. But the total that is sitting to the side that's not earning anything is $48,000, and it's not earning anything because of what I just mentioned before. It needs to be available at a moment's notice. Now, if you contrast that with 4 individuals here in a family that is actually operating as a unit, then in our family, only $5,000 from each individual is required. When each individual put that $5,000, we're putting this in an organized family fund. Like I say, so contrast it up here. There's $48,000 sitting in several accounts, but this is unorganized. They're not a family. They don't have a family fund. This is just the sum of the amounts. This 48 just represents the sum of those amounts. But actually down here in our organized family, we have a organized family fund. Our emergency fund is a family fund, and this $20,000 is actually sitting in one account, right? So the benefit, as I explained, the third benefit is there's a difference. The difference between this $48,000 and this $20,000 is $28,000, right? And the reason why that's significant is because that difference of $28,000 can now be invested in things that actually do get us more return than a savings account would get us, right? If we only require our family members to put $5,000 up, and then our emergency fund, in this situation, if we have more family members, then it'll be more money. But let's just stick with this example. But if we only require our family members to put $5,000 in, and then we have an emergency fund of $20,000, then what is freed up is that other $7,000 that a family member would have had to save if they were operating like an individual, right? And it's that $7,000 that they have freed up. You multiply that times 4, and that's the $28,000 difference. And that is money that could be invested in other things that are better than a cash account, such as a savings account. And that's basically the main benefit that I'm referring to in number 3. What I put here as a secondary statement was more members equal greater effect. In this example, I only have 4 family members in this example to keep it simple and short. But really, the family could be 20 members, the family could be 50 members, the family could be 100 members. And as the number of family members grows, the number of the benefit from operating as a unit as opposed to these individuals will grow. Okay. Okay, now that I've talked about what the emergency fund is, what the family emergency fund is, and how we build it, then let's talk a little bit about how we operate it. Okay, so I'll scroll down here, and let's talk a little bit about the procedure. We have payment plan here in the middle, and I'll talk about this in a second. But let's start off by talking about the procedure of how our emergency fund works, right? So the first thing happens, these are just the steps. First thing I want to make clear is everything we do, we have actual family structure. All of this stuff, we have policies and procedures, rules and regulations, and all of this stuff is in writing. We can have confidence that none of this stuff is being made up on the fly. Like, we actually have an emergency fund policy. We got definitions of terms, and then we got our procedure that we go through in detail here. So that is one thing to also keep in mind. Everything that I'm talking about here is also in writing. I'm just creating this video out of convenience, as a matter of convenience for the family members, right? So, but everything that we do has a written policy and procedure, and that's what it means to be an organized family with structure. If you don't have written policies and procedures that you're following, then you really don't have structure. Okay. So as a part of that procedure, let's just talk about it. This is like a summary of the procedure, but basically these all of this stuff is in this emergency fund document. But for the sake of this video, I'm gonna talk about these steps in a summarized fashion. Okay. So basically how the procedure works is this: some member of the family will have an emergency. An emergency will occur. That family member will request an emergency. Let's say, for instance, something, I don't know what the emergency is, but they need $5,000 for whatever reason, or $7,000 for whatever reason, because some emergency happened. First thing that will happen is they will call the family treasurer, and we do have a family treasurer. We have a president, a treasurer, historian, and we have a secretary. Okay, no, the historian is the secretary. So the president, vice president, that's the fourth person, treasurer, and a historian who is basically the secretary. Okay. So when an emergency happens, the family member who has had the emergency will request an emergency fund pool, and they will get in contact with the family treasurer in order to do that. Okay. As a part of this process, they will also need to provide proof of the emergency. So so in order to keep things under control, we need substantiation. Like just to make sure real emergencies are happening, people need to substantiate that emergency. Once this proof of the emergency is provided by the family member who has incurred the emergency, there will be an eligibility check, right? So we have to make sure that the emergencies, like even on our emergency fund plan, we have a section entitled, where is it? Where are you? Here we go. A section entitled eligible emergencies. Where are you? Well, yeah, here it is. Eligible emergencies. So we got sudden job loss, medical emergencies, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, the emergency has to be verified that it is a eligible emergency. And what this means is sometimes things happen that people need money that's not really an emergency. Like some things, like it's just the result of improper planning, failing to plan, and it's not truly an emergency. So we have to define what we call an eligible emergency, so that these are the things that the emergency fund can be used to help a member with. Okay, so once that eligibility check is passed, then the family member will receive the emergency fund, the money that they need in order to take care of the emergency. Okay. Now, in order to keep the emergency fund funded for the next person who has an emergency, of course, the person who had the initial emergency will have to pay back the funds that they took from the emergency fund in the first place, right? And that's where number 6 comes into play as a payment plan. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how a payment plan would work when you're paying back. When you have incurred an emergency, you have received some emergency funds from the emergency fund, and it's now time to come up with a payment plan to pay this back. Okay. Now, so as we talk about this, it's important to note, let's just use this example budget as the person's budget, right? If this person is making $3,000 take-home pay, their expenses are $2,000, then they have $1,000 left over. So this money in our family, all leftover money goes to family investments. Every dime that you have left over after you have paid your bills goes to family investments. This is part of our systematic way of investing. This is part of what's going to allow us to build our investment capital and make the moves that we need to make. Every dime that's left over, every family member must contribute to the family war chest, the family pool of investment funds. Okay. Now, if that's the way that we operate, then we have to have these other things in place to take care of other things that come up, like an emergency, for instance, right? So if all of our money is going towards investments, I need to have something to tap into if I run into other situations. For example, an emergency, and this is why the emergency fund has been created, right? So everybody in our family can invest with no concern about having money for an emergency, because the emergency fund takes care of that, right? So I kind of got off track a little bit. I want to talk about the payment plan. So the way that this works is that we understand this person has $3,000 income, $2,000 expenses when they got $1,000 left over. And if you had to make an emergency fund pool, let's say for $5,000 or $7,000, let's say $7,000. So you'll get that money immediately. You'll get that lump sum immediately, and that money will be transferred to you in whatever way it needs to be transferred to you, and you can go deal with your $7,000 emergency immediately. Now, what happens is we will put you a family member who taps into the emergency fund has to pay that money back, and they will be put on a few options for a payment plan, right? So the point that I was talking about, if this person has $1,000 left over, normally this entire amount will be going to investments, family investments, in a pot of family investments. But if you have to pay back an emergency fund pool that you've just taken, then your options will be something similar to this. Maybe the facts and circumstances will vary, and it will determine what the exact payment plan will look like, but this systematically, it would look very similar to one of these options, right? So if you have $1,000 left over every month after you've paid all of your bills, then normally all of that money goes to investments. But if you were put on a payment plan to pay back the emergency fund, then it could possibly look like this. Of that $1,000 total, maybe $500 a month will be going to pay back the emergency fund for the next several months until you've paid it back, and the remaining 500 will continue to go towards investments. One of the reasons that we do this is because as a family who is interested in building wealth and systematically doing so, we never want to make excuses as to why we can't invest. We create a system that allows us to be able to keep our investment program going on no matter what happens. Even if there are emergencies, we do not have to allow emergencies to stop us from investing. If you pull money, if you have an emergency, you can pull money from the family emergency fund. If you pull money from the family emergency fund, that money can be paid back in a systematic way without stopping your total investment program just because an emergency has occurred. So in this situation, half of that $1,000 for a total of $500 will be going towards paying back the emergency fund until you've done that, and then the other $500 will continue to go towards investments like business as usual, right? And then when you finally, several months down the road, when you finally pay back the entire amount that you pull, then you can continue your $1,000 contributions to the investment fund. Okay, so that's that. The other thing that I put here is in case you wanted to accelerate, right? So we also have this option. This is pretty intuitive, right? Maybe you want to pay back the money that you borrowed from the emergency fund quicker than you would if you were only paying $500. So you could up that to $750 as part of your payback to the emergency fund, and you're now only investing $250 per month in the investments. The point is that even if you want to accelerate your payback of the emergency fund, that's okay. You still do not have to forego investments altogether. We can increase the payback amount, but still be putting at least something towards the investments while you are paying back. Okay, so we can continue to invest without interruption, even in case of an emergency. One of the things that we say here is that we don't allow is this. The investment is so important to what we're doing as a family systematically. We're never going to allow situations such as this, right? Even in the case of paying back the emergency fund, we don't want anybody getting to the point where they're getting used to not making investments. Like the family as a whole, this is what we do. We must make these investments like clockwork every month. Everybody must buy into that culture. So we don't want a situation where, well, yeah, if I got $1,000 back, if I pay it all back, my entire investment amount, if I instead of putting it towards the investments, I put it toward the emergency fund, it'll get paid out quicker. That's okay. We don't want this situation in our family because we don't want to lose the culture of investment all the time. Investment is something that we do as a matter of existence, period. So we don't want this situation to creep in where every dime you got is going to anything, not even the emergency fund. Like we want a situation like this. If you want to pay it back faster, then put the $750 toward the emergency fund and pay the $250 to the investments, right? So this is not allowed under our standard operating procedures. But as with everything, we have to remain some type of flexibility, and if the facts and circumstances dictate, then we may be able to be flexible with this. But this is generally something that we don't want to happen. Okay. Okay, cool. So as I wrap up this video, let's just talk about some final thoughts. So number one here, I say the more people, the better. Meaning we have a larger fund, the more family members who we get to buy into operating as a unit. That means the more people we will have contributing to the emergency fund, which means we will have a larger fund. And also, like as I explained earlier in the video, the more people we have contributing to the family fund as opposed to operating as individuals, then the more residual cash that they would have to invest as a result of not having to have that larger individual emergency fund. Okay. Number two, we're free to make investments with no emergency related worries. Right. So like I said, as I explained before, in our family, every dime that you got left over goes to investments. You got your income, you got your expenses, everything that's left over goes to investments. In order to get people comfortable with that type of thing, we have to have things in place to take care of other situations, emergencies being one example. So number two, by having the emergency fund, we are free to make investments with no emergency related worries. We're not worried what happens when an emergency comes because we know that the family emergency fund will kick in. Okay, number three here, the emergency fund does not exist in a vacuum. It's one moving part of a system with many moving parts. Like I said, I think I just explained that earlier in the video. I don't have to go into that very long, but the emergency fund in and of itself is not a standalone thing. It's not out there by itself. It's a part of a larger system, and everything that we're talking about has to be taken in consideration, taken as a part of a bigger picture. Okay. Number four, written policies include eligible emergencies with A, substantiation, B, insurance, and C, payback requirements, right? So the substantiation, so yeah, like I explained earlier, we have policies and procedures. Everything is written. This is not a guessing game for anybody. You can always refer to the policies and procedures. One, the substantiation means you have to provide proof that this is an eligible emergency before you get money from the emergency fund. Once that's done, you can get the money. B, we do have insurance requirements because this is very important in order for us to keep the fund solvent, right? Everybody in the family has to have health insurance, have to have car insurance if you have a vehicle, and you have to have homeowners insurance if you have a home, right? Because the emergency fund will not be able to cover things that may happen, large expenses, if you're not insured. What the emergency fund should kick in, let's say for instance, I have car insurance, I wreck my car, and I have a $500 deductible that I need to pay in order for my insurance to kick in, and then whatever little residual money I get for that wrecked car can be added to some money that I pull from the emergency fund in order to make a down payment on a new car, But that won't be able to happen if you don't have car insurance in the first place. So part of that is you have to have you have to be adequately insured in order to be a member of the family, so that the emergency fund can stay solvent. We won't run out of money because we're trying to pay for expenses as opposed pay the entire price for expenses as opposed to using insurance intelligently. Okay. And the last thing are the payback requirements, which I already went over in detail. Okay. And number five is basically what I just said. Insurance keep the emergency fund solvent by eliminating the need for spectacularly large pools. Like, we're not paying out of pocket for expenses that insurance will cover. We may be covering the deductible. We may be covering other costs that are related to the emergency, but we're not paying for, some type of surgery for $30,000. Like, health insurance should cover most of that. But if there's a portion that health insurance doesn't cover, that's where the emergency fund will kick in. Okay, that's pretty much it.